Hello, 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 hello! I am Grandmaster Dennis Boros, and you are watching the Chess Sweep channel. Now, as you can see from the title, we'll have lots and lots and lots and lots of fun because we talk about that fantastic pawn, that legendary one that we didn't talk before. Now, I'm assuming you guys know who's leading the candidates. It is Jan Nepomniachtchi. And in fact, while looking at that game, I realized, you didn't really talk about a pawn that deserves a lot of mention, which is very important. People don't realize how legendary that pawn is. And yes, I know, many people claimed that as their own, but there was only one player, and I tell you, only one guy who claimed and used the knowledge of the all well-loved rook pawns. And before I tell you the answer, I'm curious if you guys are familiar with this person. He was famous in the 70s and 80s and was considered one of the strongest Western players of the time. In fact, there were moments when Fischer decided to say, okay, I give in, you're better, take board one when you were playing the world versus the Russians. Who is this legendary player who was well feared among the ranks of the Soviets? Indeed, Hyperborax is right on the money. Bent Larsen, the Dane, the lone Dane, very, very strong grandmaster, Bent Larsen. Bent Larsen famously said that if you're uncertain and you don't exactly know what to do, well, then you push your H-pawn. And yes, since then, many people claim that, okay, you are going to claim that, oh, the H-pawn is my move, and that's wonderful. But in fact, the first one who really used the H-pawn push and the A-pawn push was Bent Larsen. And the other players just took the notice and picked it up. Now, famously, some of the computer overlords think that, oh, we invented the H-pawn push, we're the better ones. There's a guy from the 1970s called Bent Larsen who actually showed how to utilize that H-pawn. So without any further ado, let's start setting up and take a look at those magnificent games. Study, my studies. And this is the tale of the legend of Larsen's legendary H-pawn. Okay, and let's start with this game played between Bent Larsen and Ulf Andersson. Do you guys know who Ulf Andersson is? I'm pretty much curious. Tell me more about him. What do you know? Christian Georgiev says yes. Hyperborex says yes. No, it's not Andersen. It's Andersson. It's Ulf Andersson, Swedish grandmaster from the 1980s, and he's famous for grinding endgames and a specific opening. A true endgame master. He's very famous for being on the receiving end of the Fischer Anderson game, which incidentally was the famous Hedgehog game. Yeah, he beat Karpov. He was firmly in the top 10 in the 80s and was seconding Timon. And in fact, I'm going to get you guys on a bit of a secret. So Timon was playing Karpov, and we're playing the match. And Ulf Andersson was a second. And incidentally, Ulf Andersson, of course, wasn't the only second of Timon. His co-second was Gyula Saks, the Hungarian grandmaster and attacking extraordinaire. So once they asked Ulf Andersson and Gyula Saks, who's going to win this match between Timon and Karpov? What is your prediction? And Gyula and Ulf said anonymously that, of course, Karpov is going to win. It's such a legendary story. In fact, I double checked this one with Ulf Andersson because I've got the chance to do journalism in the Carlsen Karjakin match. And there was a Brazilian journalist next to me and talking about the games with Ulf Andersson. So Gyula told me this story. So I wanted to check the info if it was correct. And Anderson confirmed. So this is how you confirm your stories, people. You check both sides of the story. Now we can know for a fact that did happen. So let's come back to this game between Larsen and Ulf Andersson. And our main topic in this lecture is none other than the H-pawn and why is it so dangerous. Now, I wouldn't be talking about this if it weren't for the candidates game today. And I'm sure you guys remember which game I'm talking about. So we're going to learn the ins and outs when you can play with these rook pawns and when you can't. So, without further ado, let's start. C4. Sort of the favorite of Bent Larsen. Now, people weren't playing the English that much, but it started to become very popular in the 70s and 80s. Why? Well, it's because it's sort of like a reversed Sicilian. And for those who don't know what the Sicilian is, e4, c5, this is the Sicilian. Black is trying to take away this very important d4 square. So unlike the classical e5 move, you're not trying to just hold the position, you're actually trying to create an asymmetrical position. You're trying to take away this square and put pressure on your opponent's center. And then they realized, some of these up and coming 80s, 70s, 80s players who really like the Sicilian, what about playing c4 move 1? What about playing the Sicilian with white? So then reverse Sicilian, the English became extremely popular. And Bent Larsen was one of those playing the English. And some of you might know that there was also an American grandmaster who loved playing c4. In fact, beat Korchnoi in a wonderful game and became a second because of that. But okay, knight f6, knight c3, c5. Now, if you play e5, if you think about this, this is a Sicilian with an extra move for white. white can go g3 or knight f3. But the whole concept is that white is playing up with an extra tempo and hopes that will be useful for an advantage. So Ulf Andersson plays c5, which is totally in his style because he was well known to be able and comfortable in playing hedgehog positions. Now, whenever I say the Fischer-Ulf Andersson game, that's something that kind of inspired Andersson to pick up the hedgehog. And in fact, even this game will feature one. Hello, Texas Chess. G3, E6, Knight F3. Now, in fact, there's some background and psychological wars going on here. So it's well known that Andersson really would love to play B6, Bishop B7, and getting pressure on the position. But Bent Larsen is a quirky player. He knows this and plays G3 early. Now B6 wouldn't make sense at all now, because Bishop G2, and there's a problem there. But Ulf Andersson is also very experienced and plays E6. Now, Larsen is forced to play knight f3, because if you go bishop g2, suddenly you don't have enough control over that d4 square, and this d-pawn just comes in time before you could develop to d4, and that would mean that there's a sudden and certain advantage for black here. So naturally, Larsen avoids that, knight f3, b6, and actually now we are back on track. Bishop g2, bishop b7, castle, bishop b7, d3. Now, these days d4 is played, but we're still in the beginning of chess, opening theory. d4 is not such a big deal and also leads to Ulf Andersson's favorite positions where he beat Karpov with. As we all know, Andersson is a big hedgehog player, so he's ready to get these positions where d6, knight d7 happens. And yes, black is a little passive, but if white overextends, then there'll be problems. And yeah, obviously, there's more than just one move. d4 is a move, rook e1 with e4 is an idea. But let's be understanding with these players. They did not know all of these information at that time. d3. And I assume because Larsen was a good psychologist, he knew that Andersson would love to get a sort of hedgehog structure. So he's consciously avoiding that. d3, preparing e4, kind of boxing this bishop in. So Andersson doesn't want any of that and plays d5. C takes d5, knight takes d5. And here, white plays queen a4 check. Hyperborax, thank you for subscribing with Twitch Prime. Thank you for using the Twitch Prime. Subscribe for 4 months. Welcome back. So queen a4 check is played here. What could be the idea of queen a4 check? Seemingly, it's just your regular patterns check. You just check for the sake of checking. But what could be the deep idea of Mr. Bent Larsen? So whenever you look at these English positions, think about strategy first. It's not always checkmate, especially not in the English. Prima Zucambo, thank you for following. So now this is annoying. Queen d7 would be a little awkward. As Fischer says, maybe queen g4 could be an idea, but even the endgame, I don't think is that bad for white, because this structure is somewhat loose, even though it looks stable. Like bishop d2, rook c1, a3, And this is slightly better most of the time for white. So queen d7 is not ideal. To distract black's development. So if bishop c6, then this bishop will be utterly misplaced. Queen c2, let's say. And the thing is, after castles, there are such moves as knight e5, winning some time on this bishop. Or you can also play d4 here. Actually, maybe d4 not. But after some preparation, let's say rook d1, d4 becomes an option, and this bishop is just not ideally placed there. You might need to waste time moving it back, and then this whole maneuver was actually fairly useful. So Anderson played knight d7. Note also knight c6 would run into knight e5, which would be super annoying. And if white could force this, these structures are usually fairly beneficial for white. So Anderson decides to play knight d7. King f8. King f8 is the move you want to play the least. So you play it in the French, but it's already the French. And in general, you want to retain the chance of castling. Again, one side note here. If white would play bishop d2, castles, rook c1, where would you put this knight on b8? This is an important question, because if you don't answer these strategical questions correctly, you're going to lose. I know, I do look weird when I say that, but I all honestly think this is an important part of the game. Now the point is, we wouldn't move this knight to d7 because it's kind of passive there. You would naturally tend to put it on c6. Yes, it blocks this bishop, but you get a lot of control on the d4 square, which is crucial. And if you ever manage to play e5, you'll get the better half of the Marozzi. So queen a4 check wasn't just for show, it was to misplace this b8 knight. So queen a4 check, knight d7. Finally, this knight is a little bit dumb over there, and it doesn't have enough pressure on this square. So potentially, white can go for d4 in the future. e4. Now, e4 is a double-edged move. Can anyone tell me what is the double-edged nature of this move? Now I'm gonna tell the positives. Obviously, Larsen has an idea behind this move. Correct, Mega Blaziken. It gains space. It chases away a very, very strong knight on d5. And on the other hand, this pawn can become a target. But it does take this knight away from that very important square. But apart from gaining space, what else does this achieve? If we talk about the positives, what else does e4 move do? Ruthless Brit, thank you for subscribing with a tier 1 sub. Welcome to the ChessVeeb channel. So the point of e4, yes, it does gain space, but also acts as sort of a wall. So this bishop cannot really pass through, and it'll be uselessly staring at this pawn. Now, if black were to redirect this bishop and attack the pawn on d3 successfully, then we would see the downside of playing e4. So should you play e4 in general? No. e4 is a high-class move. If you're not 2600 up, don't even think about playing e4. Why? I'll tell you why. So in this position, this g2 bishop is functioning. In fact, is putting pressure on this d5 knight and some pressure on the whole queen side. After e4, white is risking to completely destroy the scope of this bishop. That's something you don't want to do if you don't know exactly what you're doing. But what's amazing that Larsen senses this time this will be an exception. Ruthless Brit says, "Hi Danesh, nice seeing you with some game analysis." Thank you, I hope you enjoy it. So e4, Larsen is saying, okay, this is a special case. I will be able to use the fact that your bishop will be horrible. Now, the big question for black, what to do? And I'm going to open it up for you guys. Where would you put this pony on d5? I'm just curious what your chess sense tells you. I see knight b4, okay. Makes a lot of sense, targeting this weakened pawn. Hello, Hus. Everyone's enjoy my analysis? Oh, thank you. Knight b4, okay. So is this the only alternative? Also, Hyperborax is a good point. You can eventually redirect this knight to d4 as well. But can we do something else? Knight takes c3 also makes sense. But I would also reckon that knight f6 is also a move I'd be willing to consider, right? Do I need to take on c3? Not really. Knight b4 might be either really good or really bad. So what comes to my mind is just, okay, just drop back to f6. If you push the pawn, then the whole concept fails for white. Because the whole idea is to build this wall. You're staring at it with the bishop, but it can't really do anything. Once you push this pawn, this bishop is opened up again. You jump back, and yes, you gain space, but black got some strategical play for it. So that's the idea behind knight f6 Ohas. That black would say, okay, I see, but I'm still going to retain, over defend my pony, and if e5, I just jump back. Also, it stops d4 breaks because with the knight on f6, we have two attackers and only one defender. That means there's some great stuff going on there. Hello, Buffalo. So yeah, I like knight b4 too, but this is very double-edged. The question is if there's d4 or rook d1, d4. And if so, that could be either really good or really bad. But it's definitely an alternative. Now, Ulf Anderson, instead of going knight f6 or knight b4, took on c3. Now, in general, taking on c3 is not a bad move, but is in some ways a concession. B takes c3, and now, actually, white achieves something. No longer does Ulf has a knight on d5, and potentially, if white manages to play d4, Larsen will have two pawns in the center and a solid position. So knight takes c3 in some ways I think was a concession and not the best way of playing. Castles, rook e1. Now these little moves are very strong. They seem pointless, but in fact it's preparing the idea of d4 without actually committing to anything. And if you think about this, this is sort of the highest level of chess. You're trying to improve your situation without really showing what you're trying to do. Rook e1 is such a move. You're not trying to tell if you're going to play e5 or if you're going to play d4. Now, the stronger you get, the more sure you are that d4 is the plan of white. But if your opponent, is underrated, not quite 2600 level grandmaster, then these little slow developing moves can be very confusing. So I do give rook e1 an exclamation mark. a6. a6 is trying to go and gain space with b5. Bishop f4. Again, connecting those pieces. Also, it achieves something very important. What else does this bishop f4 achieve? Well, it controls these squares, so the queen doesn't have this very nice square. Also, it takes away this pawn push of e5. Let's say if black would get the chance to play e5, black would be playing sort of a reversed Maroczy. That only means that most of the time, white wouldn't be able to break through. And if you can't break through with white, you cannot really dream of an advantage. So therefore, bishop f4 is quite strong. Not only does it stop the black pieces from getting active on d6, it also stops this e5 move because there are just too many attackers around it. It does control the e5 square, yes, Ohas. Does the a rook want to be on the b or on the c file? This is an important question. But I would stick with the idea of rook b1 because normally you want to put your rook on an open file. Or rook d1, Ohas. So whenever you're thinking about where you're trying to put your rooks, think about this first. Is there an open file? B, is there going to be a pawn that the rook can support? If there's a pawn that you can support, then just go there and try playing that. So in this sense, I kind of like rook d1 as well, because the rook will support the pawn, and if this d pawn ever becomes a passer, it will be a good supporter from d1. Or just rook b1, pressuring your opponent's pawns. You can choose whichever fits your agenda. b5 means c2. So it's still kind of clear that Larsen A wants to stop this e5 move, B wants to achieve this d4 push, and if that happens, white will have a magnificent center and probably an advantage because of that. Yeah, hyperboric. So if you know what your plan is, you know where to put the rook, correct? So now Anderson realizes that he's not going to play e5, and he knows that f6 is a no-no. Plays knight b6. Maybe trying to get some counterplay on the c file if d4 happens. But here comes Mr. Bent Larsen. So Ulf kind of anticipates d4 to happen. But if d4 happens, then there'll be some counterplay on this file. Let's say d4, I can take or just play here. Let's say takes, rook c8, and not only will I have some control on the c file, I might even plunk a knight on c4. Somebody asked, why not f6? Well, the reason is your position becomes extremely weakened. And not just the e6 pawn, if I manage to block this and play e5, this e6 pawn will be a chronic weakness. That's why you really don't want to play f6 in this position. And even I'm going to give this move an exclamation mark, more of a mistake, not an exclamation mark. Knight b6. So d4 would run into these sort of plays. So if we move the rook somewhere, b1, it doesn't really achieve much. If we move to d1, it mostly would just support this break of d4. And here comes the famous saying by Mr. Bent Larsen. When in doubt, push your rook pawns. Yes, Ruthless Brit, h4. So h4 is played. But why is h4 such a good move? What makes this move so special? Yep, Hyperborax is on the money. So one of the things, this bishop is fairly stable. g5 would be just too weakening for black. So that's not really on the cards. But the fact is, Larsen realized that he's unlikely to play and break through with d4 or e5. As I mentioned before, e5 would just activate this bishop, which is half dead at the moment because it's staring at this wall of pawns. d4 would give counterplay. a4 is not possible because black would take it. So Larsen was clearly in doubt and realized, what if I push this pawn, push h5, h6, and create some weakness around this king? So h4 is a really good move. Looking for some play on the king side. And I remember some other people praising computer overlords that, oh, h4, h5, h6, wow, nobody's seen this before. Oh, really? Bent Larsen played these in the 70s and used it to full effect against the world's top best. Ulf Andersson is a top player from the 80s. So let's see how the godfather of the rook pawn push does it. So h5, h6 is coming. Probably the thing that people underestimated earlier on, and probably computers too, is that once you get h6 in long terms, Andersson's kingside will become extremely weakened. And in previous computer generations, they did not know the fact that that counts for a lot. So rook c8, rook c1, just over defending. c4 is not a problem. You always have d4. And again, you have one more pawn in the center. That's not a problem. Rook e8, queen e2. Now, he's not rushing, but h5 is still on the plate. Knight a4, h5. Now, I ask you the big question. How would you respond in this position with black? I'm going to even rotate the board for your benefit. What would you play in this position with black? H6, very good. Now this wasn't played, but this should have been played. Now this could become a potential target in the future, but there's another very grandmasterly move, such as bishop f8, just over defending that h pawn, and then you're safe. And there's no problems anymore. You're just doing great there. But at that moment, nobody really knew that this plan is really that strong. I mean, before Bent Larsen. Nobody knew that you need to be circumspect because your position can be really weakened. This one would create you a decent enough position. King h7 is decent, but then your f-pawn becomes a little weak. And in fact, I might have moves such as knight e5 and even knight g4, and these typical King's Indian attack sacrifices actually become very, very dangerous here. So bishop f8 is the most precise because then you don't have to look for more defenders on this square. So bishop f8 would be the best, and then you annul this pressure, and Larsen probably would have to either just do the same thing, try to put even more pressure there, or go for d4. But as we mentioned before, probably Ulf does have a lot of counterplay on that side. Anyways, this did not happen. Queen a5, h6. Take me. I dare you. Then you'll get lots of weaknesses around your king. Now, Anderson thought that g6 is fine, sort of getting this Grunfeld type of position. But he's no stranger to danger, so he wouldn't take on c3. Because even just by a bit of a glance, you can tell you must defend it. You can't move the knight because the queen is hanging. After b4, h takes. And now, you don't have to be a doctor to feel that black's position is in shambles. This is just terrible. It doesn't even matter if you win the whole queen side for black. You're just going to suffer. So h6, g6. Now, this is probably the second best way of playing this position. It's true and it's playable. You can defend against potential mates, which are the sudden threat of this h4, h5, h6 push. But on the other hand, black does need to be vigilant. One slip and you're gone. That's why I think h6 would have been much better. So c4, and let's see why and what could be the idea of c4. So Ruthless Brit is saying, so Ulf completely underestimated the play of Larsen in the king side by focusing on the queen side. No, so Anderson is correct in the judgment that he needs to have counterplay on the queen side. But he didn't really think that this h5, h6 is that strong. So in some sense, you're correct. He did underestimate the effect of this maneuver of h4, h5, h6, this rook pawn push. Copyright Bent Larsen. So why did Larsen play c4? Let's try to understand that before we move on. So the reason why c4 is so good is twofold. So yes, this now is a threat because no longer we threaten to take on g7. So we need to do something with this pawn. That's one thing that you need to defend it. What is the B option and the B idea behind playing c4 here? Hello, Gaborovich. So first off, even though we praise this maneuver of pushing the h-pawn to h6, what is that h-pawn really achieving? And then we'll understand why he plays c4. And that's the whole point of Ben's concept. And that's why he pushed it all over to h6. Well, always look for mating ideas, correct? So if somehow this lady could find a way to get to g7, it's game over. And yes, this looks like a simple, maybe even too simple of a plan, but checkmate wins the game. Hey, checkmating is a plan. So the reason why Larsen was kind of hopeful and thought that this idea is worth a try, because now the only thing that White needs to achieve is to get this queen over there. Obviously, it's not possible at the moment. But if that queen ever gets on this diagonal, queen g7 mate will be really real. So it's not about the dark squares, people. It's about the mate on g7. So yes, whenever your opponent's bishop is missing, let's say from e7, you can talk about that you want to take control of the long diagonal and the dark squares, yes. But if you spot a mate, always identify checkmate. One of the things that I've heard from Nepomniachtchi, whom actually we're going to look at one of his games very soon, I was told that this is the way he looked at positions. He thought, how could I get one of my pieces to this square, let's say g7, and he would sacrifice anything to get his pieces there. Sort of like a Tal-like mentality. So here, always identify checkmate. You might use it at some moment. c4, b4. So Anderson is trying to put a pony over there and block off all of these tactical ideas. a3. Now a3, it has exactly two ideas behind it. One of them, it stops knight c3, puts pressure there, which is sort of like a semi-idea. But there's also a funny little plan that Bent Larsen is preparing with this one. What is it? We already talked about this one, but this is pretty cute, so I thought it'd be nice for you guys to find it. Fisher said, remember the goal of the chess game. And in general, never forget, the goal is to give Schach und Matt. Can't do that? Then it's worth nothing. Yep. Queen a2. Queen a1. And yes, the queen might look unreasonably stupid on the a1, but the thing is, it doesn't matter which square it gets, as long as it safely gets on this diagonal. If it safely gets there, that's checkmate, people. So ba, queen c2. Now, since b takes a happened, knight b2 would be a blocking. So you can't really go this way because knight b2 will block, and you can't really take because the a pawn is protecting it. Queen c2. Preparing this idea of bishop d2, and if the queen is gone, you can win this knight. Bishop c6 over defending. Bishop d2, queen b6. Rook b1, queen a7, rook b3. So what Bent is trying to do is get rid of this outpost on b2 and especially this pony on a4. Knight b6. And this is a slip. This is the moment that was used by Mr. Bent Larsen. What did he play here? And why? Well, yes, indeed. Queen c3. Finally, as this knight moved to b6, Bent was quick to put the queen on c3 along this diagonal. And now, I mean, that's not problem square, but the g7 is. And since the knight doesn't control those squares anymore, he jumps at the occasion. f6. And yes, we don't like this move. And in fact, I'm sure Anderson wasn't happy, but that's the only way not to get checkmated. I mean, bishop f8 would still leave this diagonal open. So Ulf probably thought that this is the most reasonable. Now, as we mentioned this, f6 is played, but that leaves plenty of weaknesses in the position. So Bent played bishop h3, immediately targeting this e6 pawn. Bishop d8, trying to defend both of them. Rook takes a3. And now compare this position to the position before h4. White accomplished a heck of a lot. There's weaknesses everywhere. There's a target on a6. This pawn is isolated, doesn't have protection. And I'm about to pile up on your weaknesses as well. Fantastic play. All because of this h4, h5, h6 maneuver. Without that, he wouldn't be having this wonderful position. And in fact, after the game, we're going to discuss that. Why h4, h5, h6 was possible. We're going to come back there. Knight d7. Again, once you identify your opponent's weaknesses, you know exactly what to do. What should Larsen play in this position? First off, the first thing you do is identify the goal of knight d7. So Ulf is trying to bring defenders near this pawn. But it doesn't help on the other side. namely the queen side. So knight g5 is a neat little trick because if f takes and there's queen g7 mate. The problem is black can just neglect it and defend the e6 pawn. So black is not forced to take and allow queen g7 mate. But whenever knight d7 happened, you naturally should tend and think, okay, your king side is defended now. But what about the queen side? See rook e1. But in fact, this rook is super useful. Eventually, you might want this pawn to be protected. Also, e5 could be a useful move. So even though rook e1, as mentioned by you guys, are pretty decent, but I think queen a1 is very nice. Because this rook will be useful at defending and maybe even with attacking. But this queen is actually able to do multitasking. Like all ladies, this a1 queen is able to think about mating and attacking the a6 pawn. What a wonderful a1 queen. Bishop b7, g4. Hammering on and trying to open it up for the queen. Now note there is no g5 because bishop takes, f takes, and then there's checkmate. So again, you can't really stop all these hammering ons by Did Larsen. And if g5 comes, then the black king side will become extremely weakened. Rook c6, g5. Again, you can't even take because again, there's just too much going on g7. Bishop c8, d4. Now, as black was forced to the 8th rank to defend everything, Larsen finds the time to open it up. And in fact, this is what you need to remember. Eventually, if your opponent misplaces their pieces, he, she's, and her pieces, you might need to open up the position. So d4 is pretty strong here. And again, f takes is not such a cool idea because the g7 would be again weakened. And if you go bishop f6 trying to hit my queen, I have e5 and it's a classic double attack with advantage for Larsen, mostly winning. So d4, cd, knight takes, rook b6, bishop a5, and now everything is collapsing because once I take there, the e6 is fallen. So Anderson, under pressure, played knight c5, and this is the beginning of the end. Rook f3, not even taking. Rook f8, gf, takes, bishop takes, queen takes, and Did Larsen to move and find a wonderful finishing touch. Which actually is the triumph of the whole concept that Did Larsen was playing for. Boom, baby! Knight takes e6 and it's over. Why? Because of this thing on g7. You can't take the rook because you get mated, just like you get mated like all the time. And if you take this, then I can take here, takes, and no longer does this queen defend the f6 square. Your lady would be in danger, and also queen g7 and an eventual rook lift is going to be the end for you in this position. Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful game by Did Larsen, showing how strong these side pushes are. Yep, he is the great grandfather of the h4, h5, h6 moves. And any other computer overlord claims the fame for that. Well, they're late, because Larsen is clearly from the 70s. He is the true pioneer of rook pawns. In fact, he has the saying, when in doubt, push a rook pawn. But let's go back for a second, because there's something that I wanted to explain to you guys. Let's go back to this position. What made h4 possible? And that is very important. These side pushes, rook pawn pushes, like h4, a4, they become extremely powerful in a specific pawn structure. Can you play these h pawn pushes when you have open positions? Not really. Amar Sinaga has also a good point. The lack of defenders. This knight has wandered away to b6 and is not there to stop h5 pawn pushes. That's one thing. Also note that the position is semi-closed. With these pawns not contacting, you can actually try to get control on the flanks. Black doesn't have enough time to strike back in the center. Black and actually has some counterplay, but the reason that this is working is because the position is semi-closed and you can't really counter-strike in the center, so Larsen has enough time to start pushing with h5, h6. And any aggressive intentions, let's say b4, I can even consider c4, and you don't really have a good counter argument against that play on the sides. So one of the things that we learned from this game was the following. If the position is closed, you might even think about pushing your h pawns and a pawns because it is useful. You might gain some space and it could create some weaknesses. So someone's asking about winning these positions with black or white. Well, the thing is, you're not supposed to be thinking about winning the position. You're supposed to think about plans. It is way too early to say that you're winning or losing with either color. It's not like Anderson played this horribly. Where he went astray was when he decided to not play h6. So probably h6 and bishop f8, and then the game goes on. Can black win from that position? Definitely yes. Is it winning for black? Definitely not. So this is just a fighting position with chances for both sides. So I wouldn't really think that this h4, h5 plan by any means is a winner plan. But it is a very clever idea by Did Larsen and gave him plenty of play against Anderson's position. But what do you guys think? I'll be back in a second. Meanwhile, tell me what do you think about this h4, h5 plan? You like it? You dislike it? It's interesting? What's your thoughts? Oh, Has, I actually gave you an opinion how would it continue. Bishop f8. White would try to pressure on the h6 pawn, and that's kind of it. So this is what I'm saying. Let queen d2 here. Knight h2, knight g4. White is trying to get some counterplay on this h6 pawn and probably even venture to e5, sort of like a King's Indian play. Hello, Tiropita. So this is not a Karl Khan position. In fact, a very original English position. And this whole concept of h4, h5, h6 is completely different from the ones that in the Karl Khan. The Karl Khan, it is mostly used to harass the bishop on outside that position. Here, it's not merely attacking a piece, it's creating a target on the other side. It's similar, but not quite the same. Yeah, on the other hand, now white would have clear targets. So, this is not the only game I wanted to show. This is the other game I wanted, is the Gligorich one, where in fact he does the ultra h4, h5, h6. He goes all out in this one. I guess Gligorich doesn't need an introduction. Gligorich is a legendary Yugoslavian player, always in the top 10, always a dangerous player for the Soviets. So this was a big match for the two Westerners, so-called Westerners, as Larsen was considered to be one of the best Western player of his time. And then later came Fischer. But just again another node. What? No. Just another nod for the great Dane that in fact Fischer respected him a lot, even though they were big rivals. But without any further ado, let's get into this one yet again. So g3, this is the Hungarian variation, played by very strong Hungarian grandmasters such as Laszlo Szabó and Barta. They popularized it. The idea is the following. Unlike in the Reti, where you want to do the same thing, with g3, the bishop will have a clear view at the board. And that's kind of different from the Reti, where knight f3 is played, and it's just not entirely clear. if that bishop will have as good of a scope. So Larsen thought that this would be a good choice here. G6, E4. Now, this is by all means illogical, and I'm not even going to defend this. But White is trying to play King's Indian style. Now I'm talking about players of their times. They were playing this to get an advantage. F4 is interesting, but normally you want to either play it English style, knight f3, or e3, knight e2, sort of getting this Botvinnik type of setup with knight g2 castles. And these are supposed to be the ones trying to fight for an advantage or playing it the King's Indian style. So here, Larsen plays it the King's Indian attack way. c5, knight f3, knight c6, castle. So technically, we are in the closed Sicilian, where this knight is not ideally placed on f3. Knight f6, d3, castles, rook e1. So if we think about this position, usually it's not too advantageous for White. Well, for the simple reason that yes, you're up a tempo to a normal King's Indian, but in reality, you just don't have enough space to use it to your advantage. Is it playable? Definitely, yes. But does it lead to an advantage? Possibly, no. d6, knight d2, just playing the classical way. Rook b8. And now comes, I think, first question. What should White be doing in this position? So whenever you're trying to solve the problem of what to do in a position, first ask the question, what is your opponent trying to achieve? Opponent's last move, that is, Gligorich's last move, was rook b8. The plan should be kind of straightforward. Black wants to push b5. So now we need to find a way to build on the idea that Gligorich wants b5 and also do some and have some countermeasures. So it's one thing that you recognize your opponent's plans, but then you also have to find an antidote against it. So he played a4, seemingly just stopping b5. But in fact, that's not the only thing that Bent Larsen is trying to achieve there. b6, knight c4. So Gaborovich is asking, can we go c3, d4? You would actually play into the hands of Black, as Black is trying to open this long diagonal up for this bishop. If that happens, usually Black is not worse. In fact, sometimes it's just simply better. So you do have to fear your opponent's counterplay here. You do have to be mindful of Black's plans. a4, b6, knight c4. Very nice positional play so far. So b5 is not really an option because then this knight on c4 would be eternal. Should b7. And here comes the legendary move. h4. When in doubt, push your rook pawns. Gaborovich is saying, I was just following a principle. Yes, but the other principle is always look around what your opponent is trying to do. It's not enough for you to build your own position. You also have to be mindful what the other side is trying to achieve. Push the Larsen pawn. And it's coming. Queen c7. And now we do have to think. Because this is different from the games that we've seen before. h5 is not an option. Knight takes h5 would just win a pawn. So we need to think a bit of outside the box, that is. So we have to think about which pieces of whites are completely out of play or would need to get improved. Which one of them are those? Just starting with the ones that are working full time, that's the knights on c4 and f3. They put pressure here, eventually supporting e5 breaks. So they're doing well. What else could we improve? Now remember, this is a closed position. That means you need to be conscious of the fact that maneuvering is not just allowed, but is appreciated. Gaborovich, the first half of your sentence is correct. But the second part is just too much thinking in just patterns. It is definitely an idea, but try to think outside the box. It's very important to use your own ideas. Because nothing is as bad as using patterns the wrong way and then lose because of it. In fact, you would do that in a completely different position. That would be an English attack, but this is a King's Indian attack. In that case, what you're talking about, Gaborovich, the pawns aren't facing this way, they're facing this way. So it's more of an English structure. But this is the King's Indian structure, and if you exchange this bishop for this knight, then this bishop becomes a monster. Yep, you stick too much to those principles, Gaborovich. Yes. But your idea of moving this bishop is correct, as if you could exchange this bishop, and the situation would improve, and this grave danger on this long diagonal would be gone. Rook d8. How do we continue with the plan? How can we enforce this exchange? Queen c1. Bishop h6. d5. Should we take it? Should we not take it? Even, is that an option? And also, props to Mr. Gligorich for this move. Why? When your opponent plays on the side, strike in the center. But indeed, now we have this nice little intermezzo. e5 is not possible because there's knight takes e5 and we win the pawn. We just have too much pressure on that square. So the queen has to move. Queen c8, and now we take on d5. Knight d5 is also an interesting option, but Larsen didn't feel anything is wrong with taking. Knight takes d5, and bishop h6. Now we're exchanging off this bishop. So let's take stock here. What did white achieve? What did black achieve? There are always pluses and minuses in every position, whichever you look at. There are no clear wins for white or black. That's why you have to assess positions correctly. Who has more space, dear chat? Black has more space, indeed. So if your opponent has more space, what should you do? Now, if you think about space, black has control of these squares, white barely has control of e4, and not really, white doesn't even have a piece over there. On the other side, Gligorich will be able to play e5 in the long run, and if he's able to get a knight on d4, his position is just going to be advantageous. Therefore, the space advantage. So black has more spaces, says Amarcinaga, so trading pieces is in white's favor. Exactly. And again, if your opponent is playing in the center, where could you find counterplay? On the flanks. And here comes Larsen's famous h-pawn. Takes, h-pawn. It's coming. It is coming. The h-pawn is coming. Knight f6. Alright, so should we take on g6? Should we not? What's the consensus? We could take, or we can push. Those about our choices because we can't leave it there because knight takes h5 will just come. So what would be the benefit of taking on g6 and what would be the benefit of playing h6? Do we want to be like Mr. Bent Larsen? Sure. We all want to be like Bent Larsen. He's one of the coolest players of his time. If you would take on g6, you would fear a rook h8. Okay. Alright, so that's it. Takes. I understand your fears, but what could be the benefit of taking on g6 for white? Well, these pawns becomes weaker because there are no two pawns supporting, and eventually you might be able to bring your queen to g5 and play knight e5. So yes, it's double-edged, and in fact, you're right, Gaborovich. This h-file could backfire, because it can be very useful for black as well. But Ben decides to play h6, and creating a good old hook on that square. King g8. And again, we know where the targets are. Yeah, and the benefit was that the g5 has been weakened, yes. So again, we played h6. What's the point of h6 again? Well, the following. If again we could put some pressure on this long diagonal, that will be a problem. Is that really happening at the moment? Good question. Hello, Road to Chess Master. Yep, this band Larsen play is very nice. So eventually, Gligorich might want to play e5. Now, obviously, that's not possible at the moment, but, you know, if you nip the whole thing in the bud early on, the better. So, Bent played Queen f4, saying, don't ever think about these e5 ideas, your knight will be threatened, and there'll be some issues there. Also, if Black would play knight d4, probably White could just capture, just go back. But let's say if Black plays something suspecto, let's say knight b4, which would be very logical, activating the bishop, putting pressure on the c2 pawn. This would run into some beautiful ideas. Larsen to play. And win. So Queen f4 is not out without sting. It's a very concrete idea by Bent Larsen. So rook takes, bam. Problem for black is you can defend the knight, but then I just take on e8 and I'm up a pawn, just happy, and just go back. But if you capture it, queen takes f6, and this is a traditional double attack. You either defend this rook and you get mated, or you don't defend the rook and then it's gone. But you could go king f8, but back rank would be the problem right there. And as this square is protected, both queen g7 and queen h8 becomes an issue. Therefore, Gligorich decides to chase the queen away. Queen d2. But since this knight moved, queen c3 will be an idea. So f6 is played. But do we like this f6 move? Boo f6. Chat, say boo. I don't hear you. Nor can I hear you. But now, suddenly, Operation Rook Pawns commences. a5. We have two rook pawns, you know. I'm going to push this one. b5. a6. Now you don't have g4 because queen takes g4. That queen is a long-range piece. It defends it. a6. What's the point, you say? Well, eventually, if the queen could sneak to this diagonal, get to f7, meaning on g7 is not that far-fetched. Bishop a8, knight a5. So a4, a5, a6. This is basically the double Bent Larsen legendary pawns. Those pawns are just legendary. Now the issue is the following. Both these pawns are weak, and eventually, with the knight stranded and the king this weak, you might actually be able to get some counterplay against it. e5, very principled play, but it won't be enough. Queen c3, eyeing this good old weakness on c5. Knight d4, and seemingly black is doing fine. Or is he? Did Larsen to play and show who's boss. So what's our main issue before we try to solve it? What's White's main issue? Actually, it's twofold. One of the things that we hate that bishop on the long diagonal. But what else? Let's think about which pieces of ours are misplaced. We're not doing that much. The knight on a5 ain't doing a lot. So this knight will gloriously give itself for the good of the nation and says, I'm getting rid of you, saying in exchange I'll get an impressive bishop on g2. Nice little move by Did Larsen. Activating the bishop and also getting rid of the pressure from that a8 bishop. Takes. Knight takes d4. Now this is not winning, but it does put a lot of pressure. And don't forget, this king, even if it gets into the endgame, will be super good for the Dane. CD takes BC. Okay, so let's try to take stock. What happened so far? No more tension in the middle of the board, but who's dominating on the sides? Chat, who's dominating? White does, of course. The Great Dane is dominating. There are plenty of weaknesses. This structure is a little flimsy, and this knight is just almost non-existent because if you move this pawn, these guys become really weak. And if you don't move it, then this knight is just sidelined. Can become an insane target. Also, these pawns are weak. So it's just a matter of time now how he can win. Rook e7, rook takes a7, and now everything is falling like flies. King f8, rook b1. This pawn's falling, and as you can see, black's pieces are just mere spectators. f5, rook takes, and as I told you, yes, you played f5, but now e5 got weakened, and it'll be increasingly tough to stop the rush of that c-pawn. Knight f6, rook a8, takes, knight g4, rook b8, check, king f6, c4, and as you can see, yes, black kind of got a bit more reorganized, but this is just going down. Was AlphaZero inspired by Larsen's chess? More than likely, not elusive panda, because Larsen was well known for his rook pawns. In fact, he had the saying, when in doubt, push your rook pawns. Look it up, it's there. And that c-pawn is running like a madman. e4, trying to look for counterplay. Rook f8, king e5, de, fe, takes. And rook f4 is coming. And we're going to end this game here as white is just completely winning with many pawns up. So, but this is not the last game I wanted to show, but talking about fantastic h-pawns. Here's a fantastic h-pawn right there in the candidates. Does any of you remember that game? Who played it? Okay. So this one was between Nepo and Wang Hao. Because famously, it is actually Wang Hao who lost to Nepo, and now Nepo is in the lead. So this is the game between Nepomniachtchi Wang Hao from round 5. This is not just a game. This is, in some ways, the continuation of the story of Larsen's famous H-pawn. Yes, Gaborovich. e4, e5, knight f6, the famed Petrov defense, which featured in many Kasparov-Karpov matches. Fascinating opening. The amount of draws is so little you need a microscope to see it. You might want to play it if you like drawish positions. But moving on, here Nepo took on e5. d4 is the other move, which has been popularized recently by Vityugov and Carlsen. But Nepo is playing the classical main line. Yeah, also featured the Carlsen-Caruana match, but first and foremost, it first entered chess history through the Karpov-Kasparov matches. d6, knight e4, bishop d3, and the position is almost symmetrical. But there's one sole difference, that this knight is a little exposed. It's not on f6 as you might think it would be. It's on e4, therefore it's an ideal target for Nepomniachtchi. Bishop f5, kind of the new fashion. Castle, bishop e7. Most of the Chinese players like this system, trying to neutralize the pressure of this d3 bishop and kind of over defending the e4 knight. Rook e1, castle, knight d2. Sort of a conservative system. But what can we say? What did white achieve so far? Let's say after the exchanges. There. What did white achieve? What's the difference between the two positions? White has way more active pieces, yes. White already has and owns the only open file. Might even jump on e5. If you ever go back, I will kick you out with my knight. So even though black's position is fairly solid, it's also pretty passive. Yeah, this is the Nepo Bancao game, Ojas. C6, bishop f4, knight a6. And you'd never, ever expect the move played by Mr. Jan Nepomniachtchi, channeling his inner Bent Larsen. Played h4. Now, as we've seen in previous Larsen games, the times where h4 is useful is when the position is fairly closed on the other side. There are not much breaks going on and not much fluidity in the center. And when there's not much fluidity in the center, it is a very good idea to try and gain some space advantage on the flanks. Therefore, Nepomniachtchi's move h4 makes a lot of sense here. He can't really gain space anymore on the queen side, so he's going for the king side. Again, going for this h4, h5, h6 ideas. Knight c7, knight g5. First off, though, he's trying to push some weakenings and see if Bancao will make some weaknesses. Bishop takes, f6, which is a little ugly looking, but probably didn't want to let the rook to e7. This would get even uglier once you have complete domination of the e file. This is near lost for black. f6, bishop f4, queen d7. Knight g3, rook a8. And now the question is, how should we improve our positions? Because at the moment, black does have good control over these squares, even though some of these pieces, mostly the c7 knight, is misplaced. It's not doing that much. How can we improve the position here for white? So note that just pushing h5, h6 will not win you the game. You need to get some good outposts for your pieces so they can help out. As you remember, the queen and pawn duo worked so well together in those games that it won the game. Do we like the position of this knight on g3? Not really. Where else could we put it where it would exert a lot of pressure on our opponent's position? It would be this fantastic f5 square. That's why we would take on d6, which is a very strong move, takes, and knight f5. So before Nepo decides to push the h-pawn, he makes sure that he has good pieces that will support the idea of getting those active pieces. d7, queen h3, setting up some sneaky knight h6 checks. And obviously on this level, they're not going to fall for that. And now comes the big move, h5. So as far as we learned from the previous Larsen games, what should you play here if you're playing with black? It's clear what Nepo is trying to do, but not as clear how you should react with black. Yep, h6. And this is an ugly move. On the other hand, it stops h6 ideas and there won't be long-term problems. And that's very important. So that would have been much better, but Wang Kao decided to take and play rook e8. Rook takes, g4. Now h6 is going to come soon. b3, knight e3, h6. Now if you let me take on g7, your structure would provide me lots and lots of counterplay. d6 of course, which is best. And now we have to think about how to break through. So far, the position's fairly nice. This king is a little bit suspecto, but we do have to find a way to undermine that king. By alone, that h6 pawn doesn't do enough. We need to provide some helpers. So for now, we tried to open it up on the king side, and it's time to play on the other side, c4. As it happened in the Larsen game previously, we were trying to get the queen over here, but it was a different type of position. Now the question is, how will this queen get closer to the h8 queen or this square on g7? What could be the idea behind c4? Why does c4 make sense here? So what I'm asking, why not take all those pawns? What would be black's proper response? I'm asking what would happen if Van Kao would take everything on c4. How would we react? So takes, knight takes c4. Is this possible? So not elusive panda is saying end of the line is queen g3. So you're saying takes, queen g3. Why would you put your queen on g3? What is your concept behind that move? But what are we trying to achieve? I understand. Ah, yes, indeed. So take. And whenever you want to go here, you want to go back or go queen c7 and threaten checkmate. The only problem with queen g3 is that it runs into check and queen takes h6. And you're actually losing. Probably not losing, but not winning either. Therefore, the Nepo idea was queen h2. And now you don't really have that move because it's defended. And because of this extra pawn, there's no check on c6. And if you come back, I'll be able to check you here, queen d6. And eventually I'm going to take on f6. And you're just completely lost. And now you can see how the queen and pawn can interplay and provide you such a great position. So Van Kao, realizing that knight takes c4 doesn't work, played king g8, trying to run away from these threats. Queen h2, sort of keeping this in mind that this pawn won't be in these tricks if the queen is on h2 instead of g3. King f7. And now we have to keep going with our plans. And that's one of the things that I keep hammering down to you guys. Once you decide to follow a plan, follow it all the way long. And also tell me what's the idea behind it. It's always important to keep that in mind. We might want to play c5, but why? Why would we want to play c5? Yeah. Then we can infiltrate and use this hook pawn for our benefit. Also remember that not only does this create a mating idea, it also creates a potential target. If this pawn is gone, I can promote. So c5 is a very good move. Nepo doesn't really care about the well-being of these pawns because the only thing he cares is about potential play against the king. So Van Kao plays knight b5, which is a good defensive move, taking away this square and also putting some pressure on d4. Queen b8. So he couldn't go and enter through these squares, so he chooses queen b8 instead. This is threatened. And here, actually, Van Kao made a mistake. He thought that he can just go and do passive defense, but it's not the case anymore. In fact, he could have played knight takes d4, looking for active counterplay. Takes, queen e7, obvious. If you exchange, you will have more weaknesses. In fact, it's white who's struggling. Queen a6, queen e4, and with this king, sort of lonely. And that's actually the downfall of pushing these h and g pawns, that you don't really have any shelter pawns anymore. And knight f3 check is kind of annoying. In fact, this would have been the best way for Van Kao to play, and he would have enough play in general and probably could have held a draw. Sort of like a fishing pole, yes, Panda. But he played queen d7, trying to be very solid. But this didn't work. because whoopa, putting pressure on both of them. It's only king e6. And even if you look at the position, it's hard to believe that this is fine for black. And it's not. Let's try to channel our inner Nepomniachtchi and find the winning idea. Andrei then says queen g7. Okay. Whenever you're looking at these positions, what are the things that you really have to keep in mind? What are the potential targets in your opponent's camp? And that will actually guide you in the right direction. What are the least ideal pieces among those three things on the board? I mean, among those three ones on the board. I'm not talking about moves, people. I'm talking about pieces. Which one is the most exposed? The king. It wandered into the center. It's not supposed to do that. So this is very suspicious. Now you already know the target. Now it should be much, much easier to find the move. Just a side note, Andrei, then, Queen g7 is an interesting idea. Only problem with that one is that I can take and go back and capture the pawn. If not for that, it would be a viable option. g5 is interesting. But don't you guys have a feeling that this king is near mated? Big Head says g5. I see a lot of g5. And okay, so the other weakness is this h-pawn. How can we put pressure on the king and the pawn at the same time? Try to overload Wang Hao's defenses. One thing is king safety. The other one is that that pawn needs extra protection for a long time now. A queen g8, I always have queen f7 and block this check. It's not per se a bad move, Andrei then. It just doesn't achieve that much. In fact, the big move was f4. White is just simply planning to play f5. You can't take here because it's made in 1. You take away all those critical squares. You can't really walk around and the queen covers all of them, all of the other ones, and that's the pawn that shouldn't be there. And not just that f5 is near mating, you will not be able to defend the h7 square once f5 check is played. Chasing back the king to the 7th, right, no problem at all. Knight takes d4. Now it's kind of clear what white should be doing. And what is it? If you said A, well, say B. Gave a check, just tricky. He tricked me as well. Check. But now comes F5. Actually, no. Thought F5 was played. Interesting. But no, Queen D8 is the big move here. Setting up Queen D6 mate, and Queen takes D4. F5 actually, just realized, wouldn't really be that good because takes. Can the king walk? King might be able to walk. King E5. And maybe there's King E5 trying to run away. Other than that, it could just transpose Queen check here, Queen D8, and this is a very brutal double threat. You could go Knight B5, but then there's A4. The knight moves, then you get mated. And other than that, then the knight is just falling. So Queen D7, and now comes the F5 check. Once this king is overloaded, king cannot really take on F5, can't move the king because then the queen would be lost. GF, GF, knight F5, queen takes, king takes, knight takes F5, king E6, and knight E3. And remember, knight D6, B6 would be annoying. And in fact, black would have chances of surviving. But after knight E3, there isn't really any chances left, because whenever you go over there to pick up the H-pawn, I'm just going to pick up the C6 pawn, and when you think you can put me in danger, I have C6, and you can't take on D4, because C7, C8, and Nepo promotes. So after knight E3, Wang Hao resigned. So these were those games that I thought deserved a mention. The tale of Larsen's legendary H-pawn, and that's why probably you and everybody should know about chess history and legends like the Great Dane. And I'm sure that Nepo, knowing that this rook pawn pushes like h4, h5, h6 can create lots of problems, helped him to devise this attacking scheme against Wang Hao. And with that, I bid farewell to you guys. And I really hope you guys enjoyed this lecture about the H-pawn and Ben Larsen's wonderful games. Now I am going to give the torch to Fiona. Let's take a look. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll do lecture streams in the future as well. And I hope you guys will push that H-pawn more than once in the future. That's something that I enjoy doing. In fact, in the Hedgehog, you can try that out. Just something to try out and play. I hope you had fun, and I wish you a beautiful, beautiful Sunday. Goodbye.